What if I were to tell you that there is a chart pattern that you should be looking for when making your next Pokemon purchasing decision, and that this pattern repeats itself over and over again for those in-demand cards? Let's take a look at an example today and see what I'm talking about.
So I've prepared an example graph on the screen for us to review today. And we're going to start at the market accepted price that any card finds itself at. So the chart pattern, whether it's TCG Player or wherever you like to get your pricing information from, will show a card price where basically you're flat, right? So in this model here, we're looking at about $10 or so is the average accepted market price. And when I say accepted market price, that just means there's a sustained period that buyers and sellers are finding common ground and doing deals for the card in this threshold. As with any card that finds itself in demand, there is a period of increase. So call it FOMO, call it market manipulation, call it whatever you'd want. There's this period where the card price will trend up, right? Eventually, though, every card does find its peak, and it'll settle here sometimes for a short period of time, sometimes even for just a day or two before the sell-off starts, right? And the sell-off period for many cards is what I like to call a correction. And in these corrections, especially for high demand cards, the correction only gives back a certain percentage of what it actually increased. So in this example, we have a card that's right around $10 for an average price, running all the way up to about $50, and then correcting itself back down to around $30, which you can see in this example here becomes the newly accepted market price, right around $30 to $32. The opportunity that I'm talking about for buying cards is when you can spot this particular pattern in a chart itself. This period here, when you see a card start to form a newly accepted market price that is above what the previous market price was. So you can see in this example, we're about $20 higher. And what that means is that we have a card that has stabilized at a higher price point than it was at previously when it was at $10. So what ends up happening when a card reaches this newly established market price is this pattern tends to repeat itself, right? So you have these periods where cards are going to be flat and not growing and stable at their current price. And then, especially for those that are in demand, and we'll look at a couple examples in a minute, they'll go on another run up, FOMO or market manipulation and all of that good stuff. We'll see this pattern repeat. So when you see a card that's sitting in this environment where it is flat and it has just come off of its correction period, generally that's a really good sign to look at. So let's take a look at a couple of real world examples so you know that it's not just me creating a chart in isolation. So the first card that we're going to look at is the much maligned Drowsy from Scarlet and Violet base. This card went on a historic run earlier in the year. And reached heights that probably not sustainable, probably not worth of such lofty highs. But let's take a look at the year chart and see what we're talking about here. This chart should look pretty familiar for what we just saw a few minutes ago. You have this period where the card is floating about $10 to $15. It then goes on its big run all the way up to $63, which is even more dramatic than what we saw in the last example. But what's important here is when this card bottoms out, it doesn't bottom out all the way back to $10. It's actually sitting at about $25 to $30. Maybe right around 25 looks like a good price for it. So what you end up seeing is if you shrink the chart in more, you see the stabilization period, but then you also start to see that this thing is starting to move back up in the correct direction, right? So it's gaining some of that value back again. So this card is showing some really healthy indicators, particularly if you can find yourself a clean copy, that this will be moving back up again in the near future, particularly as we move towards that holiday period in the next few months. Everyone's favorite Umbreon from Evolving Skies. This card has done really, really crazy things over the last year when you look at the year chart. TCG's price chart is kind of cut off at this point, but this card basically was a $700 to $800 card for a few months prior to going on this crazy run, where it more than doubled its value. So you can see when this chart starts at about the end of August last year, this card goes from about $800 or so all the way up to about $1,800, right? And then it comes all the way back down in its correction period and lands right around $1,300 or so, between $1,300 and $1,400. So sure, it's off of its highs where it was $1,800, but you can see it's starting to settle in that $1,300 mark. And the same thing as the Drowsy from the previous tab is when you start to shrink this in, you can see it starting to perk back up again a little bit. And obviously this is a really expensive card and it's not in everyone's budget, but this does illustrate the example of what we're trying to show today. So if I look at the 6-month chart and the 3-month chart, you can clearly see the correction period, but you can see it leveling. Basically for the whole course of August now, it has been sitting right around 1,300 to 1,350. And if you look on the 1-year chart, you can see it's starting to move back up a little bit. So it's obviously no guarantee that this will continue to move in this direction, but I do think that the chart pattern that we've been talking about will present itself here again, and that eventually this card will move back up off of that accepted price. The final card we'll look at today is the Ghastly, and I think this paints a really wonderful picture of what we're looking for. Let me go ahead and get this into near mint so we can see it's about a $50 card. But here's that chart pattern again that we were talking about, right? So we have that previous established price somewhere between $20 to $25. It goes on a really big run all the way up to almost $60, right? So almost tripling in value in the span of a couple of months here. And then it corrects back and it actually falls all the way back down to $30, $35. And this card's actually starting to move back up again. So I would say we're kind of coming out of that stable period and maybe looking at another rise again as we move towards the holiday season. But yeah, that's the example I wanted to show off today, and hopefully it helped you when you're making those decisions on what cards may be good for you moving forward, cards that you may want to look at purchasing. Look for this chart, right? So if you want to call it this collector wave cycle, the value cycle, I'm not sure. I don't know if it has a particular name out there, but this is just the chart that I'm looking at for this sort of a pattern when I'm making my purchasing decisions. The 3 cards I highlighted here today do look like they are in a good period for purchasing. And especially as we get towards the holiday season, I think we'll see gains on all 3 of these cards and so many more out there. But feel free to do your own research. Everyone's budget and cards that they're interested in are going to be different. The one thing that's really nice is this chart pattern does stay pretty consistent as we move through time with this hobby. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comment section. I would appreciate a like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and do reach out with any other questions you may have. But we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for your time.